All right, we're going to talk software methodologies, which is a topic that no one has any opinions about. So I'm sure it'll be a very dead conversation. I should preface this by just saying what we've said before, but definitely like raise your hand and hop in if you have any opinions on anything. So Adam, had you read this piece?
No, I hadn't seen it before. I assume you saw it on Hacker News like a few days ago or something.
Yeah, I saw it. I don't know. I think I actually saw someone making reference to it on Twitter, and then went back to the Hacker News discussion from a couple days ago. I've been offline for the last week, so yeah. I mean, it conjures up some feelings for sure. So all right, you and I have both been in software, Dan as well, in software for the 20 years since the Agile Manifesto. So what is your retrospective on Agile?
Well, it's so, I feel like I've educated myself a little bit more in reading this document, some supporting material. But I mean, I went through the same thing that I'm sure everyone else has, which is like the discovery of a bunch of cargo cult type rituals and poorly understood methodologies that didn't add up to much in sort of toxic environments, and lots of like really toxic behavior kind of riding under the flag of Agile. Fortunately, I've never really been subjected to it.
Yeah, I was going to say,
real way.
Yeah, okay. So you've never actually suffered with Agile. Do you say Agile or Agile, by the way? I know you said Agile. Do you say Agile?
You know what? I think I heard it as Agile a lot.
I think you say Agile. I say Agile.
Huh. All right. Well,
I think there's even a reference in the Agile Manifesto to the fact that Martin Fowler is dismayed that everyone's pronouncing it incorrectly. But maybe you're actually pronouncing it correctly according to Martin Fowler.
Well, I wouldn't make that claim.
So have you ever had to endure Agile in any way, shape, or form, Adam?
Well, sort of. So in a couple of ways. So one, through the lens of our customers back at Delphix, we tried to shoehorn our way into the Agile conversation and needed to paint ourselves in that, in those kind of stripes. So exposed to it in that way.
Hold on. What do you mean? I'm confused.
Well,
so
I guess like, maybe I don't know how familiar you are with this, but like when there's a band passing through, you jump in and be part of that band, and so through one of the, when you're at a startup and you're trying to figure out what's working, what's not, and how you can be part of or counter to a bunch of prevailing winds. So you hop on some bandwagons. So for a while we decided we're, part of the Agile story and had a bunch of pitch decks that described how it was part of it.
So this is where you are actually offering Delphix up as those who are embracing Agile as a tool for Agile development?
Exactly. And to be clear,
you were a developer. Delphix turned into a developer tools shop for some brief period of time.
No. So I mean, I realize now this feels like like some sort of testimonial.
I'm sorry,
or like a therapist. No. It was, what we heard from a bunch of customers was that they wanted to turn around environments more quickly. And this was one of the, this was sort of part of the Agile process / Agile snake oil. The consultants would come in and say, well, you can't make forward progress because you're not agiling enough. And in particular, you weren't creating environments. You weren't allowing folks to test things earlier in the development process. So trying to capture, some of the desire in those organizations, some of it being well-meaning and well-founded, and some of it being based on snake oil.
That actually sounds like somewhat legit.
You're just not genuflecting in the right direction, Adam. Yeah. You just need to genuflect with your hands at a 45-degree angle. Yours at a 43-degree angle.
No. We had lots of faith healing exercises, yes.
But it sounds like, it sounds like you could make the argument that what you were doing was more promoting agility rather than Agile, which I think.
That's fair and that's true. But in order to get into that conversation, I think we needed to do our own military parades that looked agile and stuff like that. So that was one way in which I was exposed. The other was, and I'd be surprised if you hadn't encountered this too. Folks we'd hire would say, or whether it was in the engineering team, and this is like at all the companies I've been to, whether it was in engineering teams or in adjacent organizations, saying, why aren't you guys Agile enough? Why aren't you doing Agile? Everyone does Agile. Don't you know anything?
So, but have you ever had scrums and sprints and pigs and chickens and epics and stories?
I have. So again, when I was at the CTO at Delphix, we had teams that were doing that. I did not participate in it necessarily.
You sound like my teenager. Like, listen, you're not in trouble, okay? I want to keep you safe. That's what I'm.
I'm saying I didn't inhale.
Okay.
But at least not too deeply. But I guess to what I think is something that often gets missed in the Agile discussions, like those teams thought that was what they wanted to do, so knock themselves out, like go for it. And if it was helping them, whether it was because it was some sort of like phantom cure, fine. But if they wanted to do it that way, then that was fine. And often they kind of stabilized into something a little less doctrinarian.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that because the manifesto itself, I think, is fine-ish. I mean, it's like, I don't know. I think I'm waiting for Dan to unmute himself up here. I think that there are some things that are fine about it, certainly. And I think the problem with Agile is when it became so prescriptive that it lost a lot of its agility.
Oh, look, here's the thing with the Agile manifesto. This is a programmer response to something which is fundamentally not a programming problem. And it is frankly, and Adam hit this on the head, man. This is a bunch of huckster snake oil salesmen, basically peddling this like, hey, look, if you contort yourself into this weird shape 5 times a day, like the sky is going to turn orange, and like unicorns are going to rain down and everything's going to be fucking magical. Oops, excuse me. And the reality is that's just never true. And in some cases, and it was like, who are these people writing the Agile manifesto? They're mostly consultants. There's a couple of
that is. It's a very fundamental problem.
You're right. They tout themselves in 2001 as being practitioners, which they may have been, but it is telling that in the intervening 20 years, the number of books that has come out of this group of folks does kind of indicate a disposition, and certainly the majority of them.
And before,
if not all of them, are not writing code.
That's
true.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that they write enough code to be able to plausibly claim it. But yes, I mean, this is a group of hucksters coming together at a huckster convention, coming up with a huckster manifesto. I mean, to really, as long as we're all piling on here, I do feel that like. There's something about software where I feel there's so much ambiguity in software. There's so much that is unstructured in the way we develop software that we are constantly seeking people to tell us how to do it. And the answer is it's complicated. And there's not one way of developing software. And there are different constraints at different times, and different things are effective for different kinds of software. And it's a very complicated answer that no one actually wants to hear. I think people are desperate for this kind of like simplicity. I mean, it is the same reason that like religion arises, right? Where you're just like, hey, can you just like, I want some, in this, this terrible, lonely world, in this pale blue dot in the cosmos, I need some simplicity, I need some answers. So please provide me some answers on software development.
I saw a great Steve Yegi blog post along these lines, which made that direct connection with Scientology, saying, creating your own religion is a much better gig.
So, do you guys know who Ed Jordan is? Do you remember him? I see that a bunch of there's some of my. So Ed Jordan was a.
Yeah. The Death March guy, right?
Yes, and in particular, he wrote a book called "The Decline and Fall of the American Programmer" in 1992 about how there would be no software engineering in America because it's all going to be done more cheaply abroad. And it felt like, and this is basically written when I'm in college studying computer science. I'm basically being told that I'm about to be obviated. And it just did, like, none of it rang true to me, but I couldn't. I didn't know why. I feel like this doesn't make sense, but I'm too young to actually know why none of this makes sense. And it turns out that it was all wrong. And he wrote a book 4 years later called The Rise and Resurrection of the American Programmer. Like, actually, just kidding, I was totally wrong. But if you could actually buy both books, please. If I could sell you a book coming and going, that would be great. Which does kind of, I think, go to the point of like, this is actually the purpose of this is to actually sell books, unfortunately.
But you were saying, I mean, not to praise it too heavily, but like the principles are not all wrong, and some of them at least feel obvious. Or, I certainly didn't read this in 2001, but by the time I was aware of the Agile Manifesto, it sort of felt like a lot of this stuff was like, yeah, like understanding. Having all the engineers, having people working on a task, understand the point of the task, and the person for whom they're building it is a valuable thing.
That's good. Yes. Simplicity. Right.
Well,
yeah. Sorry, Dan, good.
But like at the same time, thou shalt not kill is also not wrong, right? I mean, that's a pretty good rule.
It's good stuff. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, like these guys hit on the kernel of truth. And they kind of riff on it, but then where it goes off the rail is they sell it as like, this, like, do this, and this is the solution to your problems. And like, I hate to say this because it's going to sound horribly elitist, but who are they marketing these things to?
Dan, I almost think it's like you're almost outraged that there is a kernel of truth, because it's being like the kernel of truth is being used as a toehold to actually sell you things that are quack cures.
Well, but it always is. I mean, like, I suspect that if you look at the rise of most major religions, this is people observing the world around them and being like, hey, if we rotate crops in that field, if I let that field lie fallow after I plant corn in there for a couple of years, and then I plant corn again, like, that's sustainable, and we can kind of keep doing that more or less indefinitely. But if I just tell Fred, the farmer down the road, hey, do that, hey, you should write unit tests, for example, Fred's going to be like, well, I'm not going to, who are you, right? Like, but if I say, well, God told me to tell you, right, to not plant something in that field for a couple of years after you plant corn, then it's like, and oh, by the way, if you do it, fire and brimstone is going to rain down and your family is going to go, all die. And it's like, whoa, okay, all right, I won't plant corn there for a couple of years, And similarly, if you have these kind of self-styled master agile software craftspeople, men, whatever, people like Robert Martin kind of coming out and telling you, well, if you're not writing tests for everything, then you're just wrong. And this dude has 100,000 Twitter followers and has written 5 books on the subject. You're like, well, he knows what he's talking about. No, he doesn't. The guy doesn't actually write any working software. Show me a single important piece of code that dude has written, right? Well, now contrast with like. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I don't want to take you off your role there. Sorry, Dan. Yeah, it's you're drawing the fire and brimstone. No, I mean, I think you're right. I think that there is a certain sense of like fear is kind of being used, but the thing is, like, there is a kernel of truth here, right? I mean, I think that there's a lot of the principles in the manifesto are not wrong. It's just,
and I would say it's less facile than just thou shalt not kill, right? Like, because I've been in lots of software engineering shops where like software engineers are like don't understand like what the customer wants and are isolated from it. And yeah, it's bad, but they don't recognize it as it's bad. So I mean, perhaps where you're going, Brian, like there's truth in a bunch of these things, and a lot of the failure is the religion that comes up surrounding it. I mean, just go to the agilemanifesto.org and it looks like everyone laying hands on the sacred texts.
It does look like it looks like that orb photo of like it's like of Trump, except that it's in a hotel room in Snowbird or whatever.
That's right. But then there's also a lack of specificity, which gives one lots of like opportunity for faith healers to come in and say, do it my way, and if you fail, it's because you have not agiled enough.
All right, so have you ever been in like a daily scrum, Adam?
Yes. I mean, and so yes, I have. I've been in ones that were And in fact, at Fishworks, I think we did a daily scrum of a sort.
Yes, but not calling it by. I mean, yes, like a daily communication, fine. But in terms of the
yes,
because the thing that I found a bit maddening about, or so actually maybe surprising about Agile, is how rigid it became. In particular, like the sprint cadence, like
yes,
it feels to me to be one of these. And you know, if you read what they say, and I think it was even in this retrospective, where they were saying, you know, the original intent of that was to allow engineers some time without the requirements changing, which I think is kind of an interesting idea. But then everything gets shoehorned into what became this 2-week cadence, which is, well, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. It's like there's so much stuff that is shorter than that, and so much stuff that is much longer than that. Like, why would we? I don't know. I found that was one of the things that always rubbed me the wrong way.
Yeah, I think in particular for the kinds of software that we have spent a lot of our careers working on, a lot of it just doesn't fit in 2 weeks. Like as noble as it might be to get these incremental pieces working, there's lots of stuff that just doesn't fit in 2 weeks.
But I don't think 2 weeks was supposed to be a magic number. I mean, they were in a world where like new versions of software was coming out every 5 years, and they wanted to be like, okay, we need something that's longer than an hour and less than 5 years.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. And they were in it was a world where you had this big release model. And I think being able to release software more frequently and to be able to judge software by the act of its creation, I think is good. I think that's all good. So when did 2 weeks become sacrosanct? Because somewhere along the line it did. At least for the folks that I've interacted with that have done Agile, that does seem to be a very fixed sprint cadence. Is that just me? I mean, is that not like?
I think you're right. I mean, I think that all of these things sort of calcified. I mean, look, bear in mind the context in which this stuff arose, right? You know, like I remember sort of doing software development in the very late 90s and early 2000s when I was first sort of embarking on my professional career. And it was an era of a lot of really like micro tracking of all progress done by PM type people. You know, and these weren't like people fresh out of school. I mean, they were experienced manager types who had been in the industry for 20, 25 years. And I can remember having multiple meetings with a PM in one day where they were like adjusting something on a Gantt chart in Microsoft Project or whatever that, you know, software package was. And they were like, well, do you think you can do it like 2 hours earlier? And I'm just sitting there, I'm like, you know, I'm wasting a lot of time sitting in this meeting right now.
Right.
You know, totally distracted from my programming flow, like answering this question about whether I can adjust the schedule by 5 hours so that you can move a box around on a chart that has absolutely no meaning, no connection to reality.
You know, in that lens, like Agile felt so foreign to me coming from Sun Microsystems, where, you know, I started in the Solaris kernel group, working with Brian and other folks, where our management was, I think, absent by and large, and certainly product management was, I mean, not absent, but very ignorable, and they sort of
contained.
That.
Contained is the word we use for that, Adam. They were
contained. Like in a different building, they'd show up and they'd ask you how long a slider should be, and you'd give them an answer, and then you know, send them on some other goose chase. But you could really ignore them. But in part, you know, people weren't paying attention to the products that we were working on. They were off focus.
So what was the
things.
process by which you found out whether the customer was happy with the product?
We actually had a pretty direct connection with our customers. I mean, I think that was actually one of the strengths of that organization, is that we dealt with our customers pretty directly. And that's part of the reason why I think we actually developed a bunch of stuff that was pretty relevant to them over the course of a decade. It's because we had a pretty direct connection. So I mean, like,
that's right. That notion of being in touch with the customer was just so innate.
Yes, that's right, and really valued. Like and I do think that, like, I guess Agile like hits on some of that. I am realizing I'm trying to actually get some of the Agile nomenclature. Are meetings in Agile actually called ceremonies? Because I'm on a blog entry that is, or on that last thing that is 4 Agile ceremonies demystified. And I'm thinking like, okay, that's pretty funny. Like they're making like a snarky remark. Like, oh my God, these actually are called ceremonies. Has anyone worked at an organization where it actually been called like you're invited to the ceremony at 2:00? It's like, well,
only if you wear the robe. If you're not wearing the robe,
is this like a bris? I mean, is this? Are we? What's going to happen at the ceremony?
That's the only ceremony you could think of. All right, that's fine.
Yeah, that's the first one that came to mind. What's wrong with that?
It's a good ceremony.
It's a good ceremony.
That's fine.
What's wrong with that ceremony?
Nothing.
I just bris, wedding, funeral. How many ceremonies do we have? Graduation. I don't know. I mean, there are only like 5 ceremonies to pick from, really, right? Or do we?
No, that's right. Please don't fact check that.
That's right. There are only 5 ceremonies outside of Agile, where there are many ceremonies. Oh, and so Dan, you raised an interesting point about like this, like, hey, can you pull this in 4 hours earlier? Because I think we overly enshrine schedule estimation in software, where we are trying to estimate something that is fundamentally there are many unknowns. I mean, there's software where you get to the point where there are those unknowns fade away, and you've got a lot of knowns. But in my experience, like when you hit a date from a schedule perspective, it's because you're using that date to focus effort and to determine, in particular, what you do and what you don't do. So it's like, okay, we know we're not going to do this because we need to deliver this to this customer on this date, but it's very hard to fix the actual scope and the date unless you have a really known problem. If there are any unknowns to the problem, it becomes, I think, really hard, or at least it's been hard for me. I don't know if...
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, look, I think that all of these methodologies, all of them, waterfall, agile, Scrum, I don't care. They work best for a certain class of problems, and they do not work at all for other classes of problems. And I think if you're trying to deliver like a payroll system or something like this, and by the way, this isn't to poo on the people who are working on that stuff. That's necessary, important software. And I'm not suggesting that those people are lesser programmers or something like that. But the contours of that problem are a lot better understood than, say, implementing a new
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're breaking up there, at least, Dan, for at least a little bit for me. But I think that this point about repeatability is a really important point. That software... To me, software, the reason that there are so many unknowns in software is because if you're doing it right, you are tautologically solving aspects of a new problem. Because if you're solving an existing problem, the cost of goods sold of software is 0, especially in an open source world. You should just be using that crate, in Rust parlance. You should be using the software that does what you need it to do. Tom, I see you unmuting yourself.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on what you were talking about, but I think there's a Heisenberg principle at work with software in that you can tell what's in a release or you can tell when it ships, but not both.
That's right. Yeah, I think you're right. Right.
And it's really true in my experience.
And
yeah, I don't want to throw too much rain on your parade, Brian, but I'm a huge fan of Agile and have seen it work really effectively on all sorts of projects, from like front end to back end, small to large. The first project where I saw it meaningful size project where I saw it implemented and done well was starting in 2004 with the building of S3 at AWS. I think it's easy to throw, to hurl abuse at it from a distance. If you've been burnt once in an organization that, sort of did a half-assed implementation or pursued some of these more kind of religious event type approaches to how the process is done and how meetings are run and so on. But you can take a really just pragmatic approach to building software and using not just the principles on the side, but using some processes that have evolved over the last almost 20 years around Scrum, and really get some nice velocity improvements.
All right, so Tom, this is actually it's in many ways a much more interesting conversation because I think so many people have had Agile backfire that it's easy to as you say, hurl abuse at it. But so knowing examples of where Scrum really worked or where Agile really worked, what were some of the things about it that were effective? Or I mean, what are some of the aspects of it that were so effective?
So here are a few. You give developers a quiet space for the duration of a sprint, and they have an uninterruptible window of time when they get to do nothing other than work on the tasks that were pulled into that sprint. That's just awesome. And I wouldn't get married to like 2 weeks. I've seen it work. Most teams that I've had have used 3 week sprints, but 2 weeks works for some, 1 week works for some. That's sort of somewhat immaterial, but that quiet space where product managers can't interrupt you is really golden.
Was it at all tied to your release cadence that at the end of each sprint we're going to push a new version of this particular service?
Well, that's the most central part of it, is that it's about the art of the possible, and you pull into the sprint the things that you're pretty confident you can commit to actually being able to demo in a shippable form 3 weeks hence or 2 weeks hence. The most central process aspect of that to me then is the sprint demo, where you demonstrate success or failure against those things that you committed to in your sprint planning process a couple of weeks ago, and show them either in a test environment or actually live if you've deployed it, and tick off each of the things that you committed to doing, and in return got that kind of golden quiet window of time on which to work on them.
So that's interesting, Tom, because I mean, what you're saying is that the real value was the focus that it afforded engineers. I mean, this is actually what the original Agile Manifesto, I think it came from, is trying to afford folks that kind of focus.
That's half of us. So it's a two-way contract. I give you focus. I as product owner give you focus, and in return you'll demonstrate which pieces of the things you committed to you actually achieved in that focused window of time. And it's never 100%, but it might be 70% or 80% of the tasks you took in. And, we look at them together and commit that, yes, that, these all check the boxes, you have a green light to ship them, and you move on to the next planning process. It really, I've seen so many teams, S3 again, classic example where the requirements were really, really iffy, kind of getting into starting to work on that, and they changed like month by month. So it would have been super frustrating if the team didn't have the protection of at least these sort of sets of windows of time where they could just work through a fixed set of commitments, and in the interval between sprints, then let their PO sort of push or pull in whatever direction they felt they needed to.
And then, what was the interval between sprints? I mean, what was the kind of the alternation between sprints and sprint planning?
Sorry, what was the?
Well, because what I found is often sprints end up being back to back, and the kind of sprint planning ends up being a bit of an afterthought, or we in our sprint planning we just do the things that we're going to do anyway. I guess I'm curious about how the kind of the sprint planning piece worked for something as large as S3.
Yeah, so certainly, it'd be good to have Alan Atlas on here. Maybe we should get him on at one point, because he was the Scrum Master of that program, and he teaches Scrum, so he is also a huge fan of it. But he trained a lot of people across Amazon then, on the back of the success of that, to be Scrum Masters, and as a process it was adopted right across the company. A common approach, one that I've liked, is to have 14-day sprints, have the 15th day for You start out with your sprint demo. The engineering team with the Scrum Master does a retrospective to assess their process and look at what worked well in that sprint and what could be better in terms of process improvements. And then you go into typically like half a day of planning for the next one, and then you start on and on the next 3-week cycle.
And then how about for things that didn't fit into that cycle, where you've got someone on the team who is engaged in a project that's going to be paying down some technical debt? It's going to be taking, it's going to take 8 weeks. It's not going to take 3. How do you kind of fit those folks into that? Because this is where I found that Agile really struggles.
Yeah. Well, first of all, paying down technical debt should always be part of the process in terms of how every team works. And so it's easy it's all too easy to starve that out. And personally, my preferred approach that has worked well is to maintain two backlogs. One that is a featureful, customer-facing set of takeable tasks, and the other is a prioritized list of technical debt and care and feeding and scaling and operations related things that the engineering team agrees are in the right sequence, and the product owner might not be involved at all in the prioritization of that one. They just know that that the team feels like what's at number one on that is the most important thing to take next. And typically I've shot for a 70-30 split in terms of story points that go towards features versus story points that go towards technical debt. If you hit, if you get into, a crisis of performance or something like that, it might ramp all the way up from 30 to, 100 if you need to go and do an entire sprint that's paying down debt. And sometimes if you're trying to meet an external objective, 30 goes lower. But over the longer arc of time, that I've seen that work well as a balance between the two.
So you're going full in story points, epics. I mean, it sounds like
totally, yeah,
the whole 9 yards at it. And then how do you kind of assure? And again, maybe because this is what the kind of the Scrum Master's job is when it is working, is to assure that the team has that focus for that period of time. Because I think it just becomes very tempting. A crisis arises, and we need to. Okay, we need to go. We've got a customers. It feels like there's what we said. A week and a half ago. We actually now need to change our direction. And how do you? And maybe that just didn't come up that frequently, or maybe the team was really protected.
Yeah, I've across hundreds of sprints, I've never had to abort. So, and if, like I said, my most common duration would have been 3 weeks. So, on average, then you'd be a week and a half in and something would have changed. Maybe it was one time, but something changes so radically that everything you've got in terms of tasks you've taken into the sprint is now irrelevant. That's just, that's an extreme circumstance that is really rare, given it's only a week and a half ago that you planned what tasks you were going to take in, and they were the top priority ones, So,
so Tom, I'm sure you've seen lots of failed Agile implementations or folks talking about those.
Yeah.
What do you think distinguished the success that you had against, what I've seen, what seems to me as a pile of, I've seen mostly failures, not personally, but as I've brushed against these organizations.
Yeah.
So what do you think made this so successful?
So I've spent a lot of time with a lot of different teams that were doing Agile badly or doing something that they called Agile, but really wasn't. The most common thing that I've seen take teams astray is they don't do demos at all. And so accountability breaks down, and the contract that I talked about earlier, and the trust that you get between the product leader or the product owner And in some companies, the product organization and the engineering team fails when you don't do demos. And I think that's a real loss, not just because of like the demise of sort of this contract and what it represents in terms of being able to hit velocity, but also if you construct it well, demos can be a real celebration of the work achieved, but also I've seen it, them help engineers to raise their game when I bring in, I bring EAs and paralegals and other people just say, hey, can you sit on this team's demo? And they actually love it because they're in a software engineering organization, but they feel in the rest of their jobs that they're somewhat tangential to the nuts and bolts of what the company's delivering, and they're real happy to come in and be part of the audience of a demo. So that's the most common thing that I see like not happening. The second most common thing, frankly, is that retrospectives don't happen, and so there's no sharpening of the saw and iterating on the process and celebrating the things that work well with respect to process improvements over time, but more importantly, not a lack of attention to the parts that don't work. I'd say the third thing is obsession over estimation and being good at it. And I think that at the extreme margins, maybe like doing Agile and estimating your work every 3 weeks for years at a time, people eventually get a little bit better at estimation, but not by very much. So people will get wrong, and sometimes a sprint will blow up because something you took on as a 3-pointer turned out to be a 13-pointer, and you completely ran out of capacity. And that's okay. You have to shrug that off and carry on, try and assess what is it about it that was missed with respect to how you set it, when you set out and you're planning and embarked on that sprint, but it shouldn't cause you to lose faith in the whole process.
Yes, I find that when part of the reason that software is so difficult to estimate is because it's so hard to know we thought this part operated in this way, as it turns out like it's actually misdocumented, or it actually has got defects, or we didn't understand how it was used, or what happened. I mean, it feels like there's so much, there's so many layers to software. It's very easy to end up with a problem that you thought was simple being actually much more complicated than you thought it was, through not because of a lack of foresight, but just because of the amount that's unknowable in so many different kinds of software systems before you actually get in to actually implement them.
Totally. And so one of the key things, Brian, is being honest with the fact that that's the case, and being open to very big misses happening from time to time. But one helpful tool that a lot of teams have used effectively that I've seen is over time you agree on a certain task, and that everyone will understand the contours of, and say, for this team, this was a 3-pointer. This is what a 3-pointer looks like, and this other thing was a 5-pointer, and you keep those as golden tasks, so that and the next time, maybe in 6 months' time, the team will be different in terms of its velocity. So you come along with something that looks a lot like that 5-pointer that you took 6 months ago, and you say, okay, this is really like that. This should be a 5-pointer as well, and you find out that it turns out to be an 8 this time around because the profile of the team has changed a little bit, or there was some misunderstanding in terms of what it takes to get that done now, and how it's different from 6 months ago. But
I think,
yeah,
I think one of the reasons that it's so hard to estimate these things is that the industry is still very young. We've been writing software now for like 60 years, somewhere around there, or I get 70. And, compared to human beings building bridges, where we've been doing that for thousands of years. And the body of knowledge around how to do that and how to successfully build a software project, it just isn't there. And you know, I go back again to this context thing and sort of the rise of Agile. And I think it's very important to contextualize these things in the sense that, you know, in the 90s, nobody, I mean, like, we're still not good at this, but nobody knew how to do it back then. And that was why you would have, you know, the project manager pulling you in 3 times and being like, can you shave 5 hours off of this thing? And we're going to track this stuff meticulously. And I mean, does anybody remember things like the personal software process and the team software process and the Software Engineering Institute and the stuff that those guys were putting out?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, well, we learned that we were all sinners because we weren't working on the space shuttle software. There was only one SEI level 5 organization in the world, and you don't work for it.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, like a lot of those processes were oriented around very fine-grained tracking of your time, and it was like, you know, write down everything you do all day, you know. And I remember I tried to do this, and I ended up stopping because I was so embarrassed, because I was like, well, you know, 1999, half of my time spent, you know, per day is spent reading Usenet, and you know, like maybe a couple hours a day are actually like, you know, applying fingers to keyboard and text editor. And, you know, it's like, gee, am I a terrible like software developer as a result of that? Well, the answer is kind of no, because I was learning a lot by reading Usenet at the time. And I could take those things and I could apply them to my work. And then, you know, that 4 hours might save me 2 weeks or some crazy thing like that, you know? And so when I look at things like Agile and indeed all of these processes and methodologies, it's all about trying to be like, hey, there's this completely unruly discipline that nobody knows how to do properly. Let's try to figure out a way to bring some structure and order to this thing, because right now it's just chaos, and chaos is not good from a business perspective.
Well, but I also think
the key point here, though, is that you know, this is a young discipline. People will continue to be poor at estimating the effort to achieve a certain task for some considerable time to come. But one of the great things about Agile is you get people working on the most important tasks at the top of the product backlog. And the way in which I've seen projects go off track in the worst way is you have teams of people working on the wrong thing.
But Tom, doesn't that reflect just a disconnect with the customer and the customer's needs? Like, isn't that, I mean, understood that that's part of the Agile Manifesto, but
I mean,
is it that
totally
lacking of that true north?
It is adamant, but like a lot of these, a lot of the meetings that we're talking about here, and this conversation has been mostly Scrum focused. Organizing most of these meetings is about facilitating communication between the people who are developing software and the people who are having conversations with customers, and making sure that everybody has the full context of what's happening. And some people really benefit from the level of rigidity that is set out by these individuals who are proposing very specific rigid processes, at least at first, because prior to that, they were just not having these conversations. They weren't talking, you know, the engineers were not talking to the product owner or to the support engineers or to the salespeople or to anyone to be able to really understand the full context of the things that they're doing. So these meetings are mostly about facilitating that communication. And I find that for high-performing teams, or teams that, you know, become high-performing, they'll often, you know, start off with one of these more rigid processes, likely have some number of retrospectives in which they pare down the number of meetings they have to the things that are truly delivering them some value in communication, to the point where they get a good balance between, you know, having those communications to gain context, as well as having the space and time to be able to really have uninterrupted blocks in which they can focus on producing software. Also, to your point, Dan, in the US at least, we're pretty bad at estimating how long it takes to build a bridge and how much it costs to build it. So I'm not sure if we're, you know, bridge building and subway building are particularly gold standards in terms of estimation either.
All right, fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, absolutely, Ian. And to your point, I mean, I think that if you take construction, and let's not talk about a bridge, but maybe like a parking lot or something where there are often we've done this before. I'm going to put a foundation in for a house. I have done many of these foundations. This foundation is no different than the other foundations I've done. I've got very good estimates for how long this is going to take me. I know exactly how long it's going to take me because there's a repeatability there. And I mean, I think, and probably like any software engineer, if I were to go rewrite the software that I have written over and over and over and over and over again, I would get really, really good at estimating how long it would take me to go do it because I've done it many times before. We don't do that in software. We don't rewrite our software. And in fact, what we are doing is often entirely not repeatable. It's new. And whenever a construction project looks like that, Ian, to your point, it has all the problems that software has. And so we are in the Bay Area here, where we, for somewhat strange reasons, decided to build a self-anchored suspension bridge in the East Bay span of the Bay Bridge. Only the second self-anchored suspension bridge ever made. This allows you to not have these, because these concrete anchorages, I guess, are very upsetting to a bridge engineer. It's not really clear to me. I mean, I know that we software engineers do this all the time, so I shouldn't besmirch a civil engineer that's doing this. But in a self-anchored suspension bridge, as my neighbor who's a civil engineer, a cynical civil engineer says, you get one bridge for the price of two, because you have to build the bridge on top of that bridge, wrap the actual cable around the bridge, and then destroy effectively this first bridge that you built, and the thing will anchor itself. And that bridge went like 6-7x over budget in every conceivable dimension, had all sorts of problems that no bridge had ever seen before, because they were looking a lot more like a software project in the way they were doing it. And it was a new, and there were many aspects about that project that didn't have analogs in previous projects. So I don't feel that like this is, Dan, you're saying that this is because software is new. I think it's deeper than that. I think that software is this very beautiful but paradoxical confluence of information and machine. And it looks like both and neither at the same time. So it's when we develop software, developing software to me is more like, it is as much writing a novel as it is building a bridge. In fact, it's kind of the confluence of the two of them. And it can be, as a result, really, really hard to have forward visibility, especially into the software that is the most innovative software. I mean, if you look at the software that has been the most important, and you look at the history of its development, but that's why I'm really interested now in the history of S3, because S3 would be a real counterexample to that, where you've got a really piece of very innovative software, very important software, developed with a methodology that's often not associated with that kind of software. Can someone write a book on that, Tom? I would just be.
So yeah, I think that the repeatability aspect of that is sort of part of the context that Dan was asking for earlier. There's some talk about whether or not the authors or the signatories of the manifesto were writing code or not, but I think it's actually more important where they worked. And it's not the type of projects that they worked on, but it was that customer relationship. But, I don't disagree with anything Tom said, but what he explained was mostly about how it became a management methodology, but it started as more of a customer relationship tool. So when you showed up to that demo and you showed the working software that values so much, you were showing that to the customer. These were like consultancies. They were building the 15th website that year, and all the websites were mostly the same. So there really was a repeatability aspect to it. But you were sort of saying, okay, Dan's right. We don't really know how to make this, but we're going to try our darndest for 2, 3, 4, however many weeks. And we're going to come back to you and prove that we did something and give you a chance to walk away. So I think that, going back a little bit further in the conversation to the discussion of Sun and Sun's engineering relationship with the customers, you had higher sticker prices, which meant probably fewer customers per engineer. And, if a product manager comes in and wants to reprioritize something, why? The customer's not going to walk away. They were using Solaris. They were bought into Solaris for the next decade. And whatever sort of hiccup had occurred in the 2 weeks that you may have called a sprint, it wasn't going to change the relationship with that customer. So it wasn't worth doing. I think that's, there's a gap that we've sort of been alighting over, where it jumped from manifesto principles that were adopted by teams to this like management methodology that is quote unquote implemented across an organization.
Yeah, true.
We're also sort of,
sorry, go ahead, Dan.
We're also sort of looking at the unicorn success here, and I would claim that for sort of every successful deployment of agile methodologies in AWS, there's a significantly larger number of failed applications of the methodology across a whole bunch of other organizations. And, we've talked a lot about Scrum specifically, but at the time that the Agile Manifesto was written, I don't know that the signatories were thinking about like, yes, Scrum is the thing that it should be. I mean, there were other things that were sort of in play at the time, like extreme programming. People still thought that was a good idea. And, it's like, well, we have to prepare.
Well, the manifesto itself was a compromise between all of those people. Like the inventor of Scrum, the inventor of Scrum programming were signatories, and the manifesto was sort of okay, what are the things we can all agree on? Because I'm sick of fighting with all you guys. Let's turn our attention outward and spread our gospels where we can.
You get to kind of a good point though, but in terms of like, I'm sick of disagreeing with these other people. It's like, well, maybe you're focused on slightly different problems. I mean, the one thing that I think that this is, a persistent point of frustration with Agile is this kind of trying to apply it to every kind of problem, and I think it applies really well to some kinds of problems and not really well to others. I think there's a real danger. I mean, we used to call this a silver bullet, right? That there's no single silver bullet. And I think that there's a danger of deluding ourselves into thinking that there is a silver bullet. And I think things I like about the manifesto is that it is actually more directional and less prescriptive. And I think that Tom, I find it really interesting that you say that the thing that was most valuable, or rather a common failure mode of people for whom that they're not applying it properly, is this kind of lack of a demo. And the idea of working software as the primary measure of progress is highlighted in the manifesto, and yet you go to a lot of these agile coaching kind of pages, and they don't really talk about the demonstration as much. They talk about chunking up the work, but not emphasizing the demo. I think it's kind of, because certainly we have found, I mean, just to speak from an Oxide perspective, like demos are great. They're energizing. They bring teams together. They give something very concrete to focus on. They can also be, though, very small. And so, Tom, one question I've got for you on the demos, and again, at Oxide, we've got a particular sense of problems we're solving, but, someone will demonstrate, something booting, which to most people would just be like, is that even like a problem? And of course, for us, that's amazing. If you've got a guest booting with a particular device being attached or what have you, even though it's not very impressive as a demo. And Tom, I got to imagine that a lot of those S3 demos along the way were only impressive to those who were immersed in the problem being solved.
Of course, yeah. And, seeing something boot, if it was previously unable to boot, is remarkable. Sometimes a demo is showing a graph that shows a shift in performance of something that isn't directly tangible for the participants who are observing the demo, but the graph carries the message. It always won't be the most entertaining thing, but again, it's the closing of the contract, and there's the sort of circular dimension to which the demo shapes how you qualify the things that get taken into the sprint, because sometimes you see a task and you feel like, okay, that sounds like the most important thing to do, and I get it. But you start to think about, wait a minute, how would I demo that in 3 weeks? What would a demo and a declaration of success against that really look like? And there are times when you'll sort of step back from it and say, hey, wait, this really isn't takeable because it's actually there are many different pieces of it, or it's too ambiguous to actually be able to demo something and declare that you successfully executed against how that task is described. So it needs more work.
And Tom, did you find teams inside of AWS that were taking aspects? Because certainly, I look at the when software development has gone well or been successful, there are certainly like pieces of Agile that are often present in terms of like things like being demo heavy and focusing on working software and being able to iterate quickly and so on, but without some of the other rigidity. Or did you find that it was kind of like, no, listen, if you want to take a fraction of this, you need to take story points and the whole works.
You take the stuff that's of value to you, and call them story points or tokens or whatever. But there's some way of use Fibonacci numbers, use something different. There's some way of expressing granularity with respect to task size and declaring that the relative granularity of these lays out in this way in terms of how many of that sort of task it takes to would add up to this one. Bottom line though, being prescriptive does you no good, but being attentive to what within the methodology works for you and doubling down on that, I think, is the path to success. And by the way, Agile isn't just used in AWS; it's used throughout Amazon by probably at this stage many thousands of teams.
And
I would argue
Aaron,
that the core idea behind Agile is you don't know the requirements at the beginning. You have to build things and iterate it and demo it to people and find out new things you didn't know about the requirements. The exact same thing is true for your Agile development process. If you say, oh, I got this book and we're going to follow this book's procedures exactly, you've just waterfalled your business by saying we're going to follow Agile perfectly. Like, no, you see what works for your team, and the things that work for your team you keep doing and evolve on that, and the things that work badly you abandon and don't do those things. I mean, so to use the watchmaker analogy, if you come across a watch and it works, it's not because someone sat down, thought about real hard how to design it, and it's like, aha, I have this perfectly intelligent design for a watch, now I'm going to build it. No, they made thousands of different iterations and found out what worked and kept the things and made it more complicated and showed it to people who are like, you know what, I need a minute hand. And they're like, okay, let me go back and add that.
New invention for 2022, the portable sundial. But isn't that though in direct opposition to what some of the Agile like manifesto signatories will say on forums like Twitter? And again, I go back to the people like Ron Jeffries and Robert C. Martin and so forth, who, Martin specifically will tell you if you're not unit testing everything, then you're wrong. And you don't need static typing, for example, because I just write all of these unit tests. I don't have errors in my code because I'm a disciplined, clean coder. Like, it sounds to me, and this becomes the one true Scotsman thing at some point, but people are describing aspects of Agile methodology that do in fact work. And this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the hour, where, yeah, there's kernels of truth in all of these things, But when we talk about Agile programming, like, what does that mean, And some, like, philosophical...
I think that chameleon nature is actually the key to its success and why we all pretty much hate it. It's that, 90s, we don't know how to make software. Software is mainly used to sell servers or to run some particular type of business. And I forgot the author of the book Brian mentioned about the demise of the programmer was coming. Yeah. I actually think that book is right, but early. Eventually there is some point where we're going to create most of the software that is opportunity cost based, and we're going to go back to that type of software that is just incrementally used to improve a business, like it was in the 80s and the early 90s. The thing that caused that book to be wrong, in my opinion, is things like Agile, which allowed the industry to scale up management precisely through letting people pretend to agree while actually disagreeing, going off and doing their own thing and creating some software. And in the end, it would be revealed that nobody was really talking about the same thing anyway, but everybody was left with working software to sell. And so, money makes a lot of problems go away. So at some point, we're going to hit some new barrier miniaturization of technology was a key to letting Agile thrive. But we need like another management methodology and another miniaturization wave or something like that in order to push that book's predictions off another 20, 30, 40 years. But eventually, I think we can all tell that we're going to get to that point. It's just what is the social mechanism that we're all going to use to keep pushing that off until we retire.
Yeah, I don't know if I've got the stamina to go back and reread that book. It's a book that I threw out as enraged as a younger software engineer, so I'm not sure I could actually go back and reread it. Maybe I should. Jordan, it should be said, had a long history of getting things very, very wrong. So Jordan became somewhat infamous for forecasting that Y2K would be an apocalypse. Moved off the grid in New Mexico, I believe, into a bunker where he continued to hold court and explain to any media that would come calling how software had effectively destroyed the civilization or would destroy civilization in Y2K. And there's actually a great, I'd love to be able to find it. There's a great what was then the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour interview with Jordan, where he claimed that New York City would not have water on the morning of January 1st, 2000. And good on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, they actually went in and interviewed the folks that developed that were responsible for the New York City, the Department of Public Works. And they were like, we did not understand why you wanted to interview us with respect to the story. They're like, well, there are some folks in software engineering who believe that the water system will not operate on January 1st, 2000. So do they understand the way it works? Like, well, so the water is in the Adirondacks, which is at a much higher elevation than New York City, and just works by gravity, actually. And it's like, well, are there microcontrolled valves? It's like, no, let me show you what one of these valves look like. And of course, they're gigantic, right? So, and of course, New York City had water, and there were no water issues in Y2K. But so Jordan got things often wrong. I mean, he was always
we misinterpreted the sacred text. It's actually 2038.
That's right. It's 2038, and in 2038 actually will be interesting to see what happens. I do feel that, like, in Tom, I guess one question I definitely got for you is, it is unquestionable that some of this miasma around Agile, and even this blog entry that we're talking about refers to a Dave Thomas piece where Dave Thomas gets very frustrated with Agile and says that, once the manifesto became popular, the word Agile became a magnet for anyone with points to espouse, hours to bill, or products to sell. It became a marketing term, which I think is what a lot of us are reacting to. I mean, do you feel that it must feel to you that it's hey, this is somewhat unfortunate that this term is being sullied by the hucksters when this process, as described, has had so much value for you in your personal history?
Yeah, a little bit, Brian, but I don't pay a lot of attention to that.
Fair.
I've just seen so many positive proof points of how it has worked for teams, and each time I've been in an organization where they said, that just hasn't worked for us. You start to, as I've asked, well, like, tell me about your implementation and so on, and you come across people who are following a blog post or following a book, but not really, and
I mean, Tom, you know what this means. I mean, you have to write your own book, obviously. I mean, you got to be.
Maybe there are too many already, and that's the root cause.
I think that there's some truth to that, where it just feels it feels like one needs to be less prescriptive when talking about software. That it's very hard to be as prescriptive as a lot of these folks are. Because there's just too many opportunities for it to go wrong. But I do think I would be curious to learn more about the development of S3 in particular, because I think it was happening it is effectively, as far as I'm concerned, the first publicly available web service, really. I mean, I'm sure there are counterexamples to that, but it's definitely very early. And
to me, Brian, I did an article for ACMQ. It's in CSCM.
Yes. Yeah.
Conversation with Werner that but it really gets to not just sort of the the early days of how it was built out and so on, but my starting point was at launch. It was composed of 8 services, and last November, actually, I guess it was a year and a half ago at reInvent, Werner casually threw out that it was made up of like 262 services, and I felt like there was a fascinating nugget in there in terms of how something can scale and have like the fundamentally same characteristics over time, over a period of 14 years, and evolve from 8 services to 262, and from a single agile team to a very large number of teams now, and both what was it about how it was initially designed and constructed, and how the teams worked that facilitated that evolution, because that's evolution on a scale that we don't often see. And also, what were some of the unanticipated surprises that popped up along the way? So.
Yeah, it's actually I wouldn't. We'll obviously link to it in the show notes. This interview between you and Werner. So it sounds like in terms of the actual development, you do mention in that interview that it was an agile team in the canonical sense. It would be interesting to know, was that the first agile team inside of AWS, or had it been adopted earlier?
It was the first. And
interesting.
The guy who was leading that team and Scrum mastered that process for however number of sprints it took, was a very pragmatic advocate of Agile. And his next role after launch was to be a Scrum Master trainer throughout the company, which he did really effectively for a few years.
Yeah, that's it. Well, like I said, you should write a book. It would be interesting to actually read that history, and certainly that the interview is great. I know I read it when it came out, but it merits a reread for sure.
So if the idea is that Agile has proven to be something that's very powerful but easy to get the implementation wrong, is there something that is to Agile what Rust is to C?
Ooh. Way to bring it back.
Exactly.
To me, so far, it feels like Agile is more like a guideline rather than a target to hit. Every team I've been on has treated it as such. I can't say that anyone's strictly fallen Agile as a methodology or Scrum strictly as a methodology. And going back to like measuring effort or time, I would say if you do it over the long term, estimates are garbage. But the one thing that you do find is that if you have the same team for an extended period of time and people are doing some sort of measurement, it does get consistent. So if you do track those over time, things can be consistent in terms of points or time. But once your team changes, that can go under the bus really fast.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I was struck when Tom said that the Scrum Master stuck around the S3 team for the duration of the project. I've worked on about a dozen different Scrum teams, and I think only one that I can remember did the entire team stayed around for an entire project. And I'm talking like 4 months. So I think, the Agile is sort of successful in organizations and teams that have trust or can build trust. And it's unsuccessful when you don't have trust or can't build trust. And I think, in the absence of trust, one of the ways to build trust is reliability. And that's where all the ceremonies come in. But was it Aaron's question about what is better? I think you can look at, just about any methodology that provides a set of points that people can rely on in lieu of that trust as a on-ramp to trust. But really, if you talk about successful Agile teams, they're almost always high trust teams.
So you are getting to what is, I think, my favorite line from Tracy Kidder's A Soul of a New Machine, where Tom West deliberately decides that he's going to manage via trust. And the line that I love is he says that trust is risk, but that he found that because I absolutely agree with that. That I think that the best work that we do on teams are when we trust one another, when the team trusts one another, and when I think that's when people feel they can do their best work. And how do you, I mean, I think you want to have that trust. And then I have also found the other bit that I found that is extremely useful is having those demos. The fixed cadence I haven't quite gotten to, but I think that or not on that tight cadence of that kind of 2 to 3 weeks, but having a real demonstrations I think are really important for all of the reasons that you talked about, Tom, in terms of serving as a team catalyst and everything else. But there's still a lot of ambiguity in there, and that's not prescriptive at all. But those are just the things that I've observed that are tend to be true across high-performing teams. So I think we've hit the hour here. Adam, any closing thoughts?
I thought this was a great discussion, and Tom in particular, thanks for joining. In this blog post, I thought one of the most interesting questions it raised in this 20-year retrospective of Agile was, what do we want to do differently next time? And in this discussion, the thing that's been coming up is when Agile has failed, the answer can't just be you're doing it wrong, you're not doing it enough, you're not believing in the religion sufficiently. So I think baking in to the next set of principles, that evaluation. How do you know? Everyone has said you do what's right for your team, but how do you execute that evaluation? How do you know if it's working for your team? And I think that's what I'd want to see either in the extension of Agile or whatever comes next.
Yeah, looking for that that rust to Agile. That's going to be
that's right.
That's a book I'll buy for sure. All right. On that note, thanks everyone, and we'll see you next week. We're sorry for the hiatus, but we were kind of out for the last couple of weeks, but hopefully we'll get back on a more regular cadence. Thanks everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.